Hello, everybody. Welcome to the launch of Geoff Mynett's River of Myths, People of the Upper Skeena, 1821 to 1930. Thank you so much for joining us. You can let us know where you're joining from in the chat, and also make sure that everybody can hear me, and we're recording. My name is Sarah, and I am the production coordinator for Caitlin Press. I've had the pleasure of working with Geoff on this book and the last 3 books. Caitlin Press is an independent Canadian publisher located on Vancouver Island. We publish culturally significant books, including fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. Caitlin Press is also home to Dagger Editions, an imprint for the voices of queer women identifying writers. I'll start off by thanking some of our funders. I'd like to acknowledge the support Caitlin Press receives from the Government of Canada and the British Columbia Arts Council through the Canada Book Fund as a small independent publisher. Thanks to Book Warehouse in Vancouver for being our bookstore partner for this event. You don't have to be in Vancouver to order River of Myths from Book Warehouse. You can order the book from them online by clicking the green button at the bottom of your screen. It should be right here. You can also find the book in your local independent bookstores and online. And if you have any questions about where to find the book, you can reach out to me at caitlinpress.com. I would also like to recognize that this event, although virtual, does take place on the land of Indigenous peoples. Caitlin Press is located on Vancouver Island on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish, Nuu-chah-nulth, and the Khoikhoi-Khewok First Nations. In recognition of the recent Truth and Reconciliation Day and the upcoming elections, we'd also like to encourage everyone to read the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And Caitlin Press and Dagger Editions joins many others in asking the government to honor all of the 94 calls to action. So before we begin, I would like to just go over a little bit more housekeeping. Give people time to kind of trickle in. We're only a couple minutes in. We are recording this, this event. So you can go back and watch this if you want to. It will be hosted on YouTube, and you'll be able to find it through our website and through our social media. Everyone can see the chat. So please keep your comments friendly and fun. The chat is not recorded on YouTube, however, so that will not be seen at a later date. This is just for us to celebrate tonight. If you'd like to hide the chat, because it may get a little distracting on the desktop computer, you can put your mouse in the upper right corner of the chat, and a little arrow will pop up, and you can tuck it away if you'd like. If you'd like to ask questions directly for Geoff, we recommend that you click the Ask a Question button on the bottom of your screen rather than putting it in the chat, just because the chat will kind of keep moving and it'll get buried. This should be on the bottom of your screen, and it says Ask a Question. Right now there's a little 1 beside it. We have 1 question. And you're also encouraged to upvote questions if you feel like you're really wanting to have Geoff answer that question. All right, and once again, I just want to remind everybody that you can buy the book at this little green button that says Buy the Book on the bottom of the screen. And now I would like to introduce tonight's hosts and give a little summary of the book that we're all here to celebrate. River of Myths, People of the Upper Skeena is a collection of extraordinary stories about ordinary people from BC's wild frontier. Geoff Mynett returns to the Skeena River community of Hazelton to shed new light on the wide spectrum of characters who left their mark on the area. Delving as far back in time as the early 1820s, Mynett covers over a century of change in the small community which, due to its location on the forks of the Skeena and Bulkley rivers and proximity to mountain ranges, seemed destined to be a hub of activity. Always industrious, often prosperous, and occasionally scandalous, while maintaining the charming nature of a small town. I would like to next introduce our moderator of the event. Crystal Henriksen has a special connection to Hazelton, as her father-in-law was a physician in residence at Wrench Memorial Hospital, which was founded by Horace Wrench, the main character and focal point of Geoff's first book, Service on the Skeena. Crystal is the business partner of Geoff's daughter-in-law, Annika Reinhardt, and she has graciously hosted all of Geoff's previous launches. We are very lucky to have her again. And next up, we have the author. Geoff Mynett was born in England, where he qualified as a barrister. After emigrating to British Columbia in 1973, he became a Canadian citizen, requalified as a lawyer, and practiced law until his retirement. His first book, Service on the Skeena, Horace Wrench Frontier Physician, which was published by Ronsdale Press in 2019, received the Jean Clark Memorial Award. His second book, Pinkertons and the Hunt for Simon Gunanoot, and his third book, Murders on the Skeena, True Crimes in the Old Canadian West, were both published by Caitlin Press and were bestsellers. All three books were bestsellers in BC, specifically. Geoff and his wife Alice live in Vancouver and have 2 sons. And I will now invite Geoff to join us on screen so he can say his hellos and introductions. And I will also bring Crystal on screen as well so that we can begin.
There we are. I don't see Crystal yet.
There.
Hello.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Sarah.
All right.
1973 seems a very long time ago now. But thank you for everyone who's attending tonight. It's great to have another virtual book launch. Maybe for the next one we can have an in-person book launch and have a party. I'd like to thank Caitlin Press and Vicky and Sarah and Malika for all the good work they've done on these books. And Meg Yamamoto, the editor, who's also been invaluable to me. I'd like to thank Morgan Haidt, too, for his very clear and helpful maps. Obviously, I want to thank my wife Alice and my family for their encouragement, support, and Alice for her close editing of the first dozen or so drafts. And I also want to thank Crystal for hosting these events. It's really great to have you. Now, I'm really excited about this book. It's a book of stories about people who have contributed to the history of Hazelton and the Upper Skeena. Not all of them are important by any means. And some were only visitors for a short or long period of time, but they've all contributed in some way to the history of Hazelton, that beautiful and fascinating little town at the forks of the Skeena River and the Bulkley. The indigenous people were there first, of course, and around Hazelton we have the Gikzan in Hazelton and numerous villages around there. And across the Bulkley River we have Wet'suwet'en at the very north-west tip of their territories. I haven't included any of their stories because for 2 reasons. First, because I don't know any. The second, because their stories are really theirs to tell, and I couldn't in all integrity tell their stories at all. Although these are stories, that term has a bit of a ring about it of tales and myths and just stories. Whereas, in fact, as people who know me know, I base these stories very firmly on the documentation and the contemporaneous records. So some of the stories are based on the Hudson Bay Company records, some on trial records, some on diaries, newspapers, and some on archives in the Canadian Archives in Ottawa. So I've always tried to be faithful to the original stories. The stories stretch back to the 1820s. Now, this is going back to the very early days of British Columbia history, especially when you think that Victoria was established as a Hudson's Bay Company fort in the 1830s and didn't really become a town until the 1860s. And Vancouver itself wasn't set up until 1885. So really we're going back to the very, very early days of this province's history. So there are about 26 chapters, some short, some only a couple of pages long, some longer, about various people. And I've tried to tell their stories faithfully. And some of the chapters reveal a little bit about what the stories are about. The first one is about William Brown and Simon McGillivray, who were among the first in non-Indigenous people to reach out and arrive at the forks of the Skeena. Simon McGillivray was a Hudson's Bay Company trader, and Hudson's Bay Company was losing market share to the British and the Russians and the Americans on the coast, and they were thinking of establishing a post at the forks. They didn't at that time. That took another 40 years before that happened. And the second story is about the founding of Hazelton and the story of Thomas Hankin, who came up in the 40 years later and saw the business opportunity of establishing a trading post across the forks of the Skeena at what is now Hazelton, because the Omanika mining boom was in full swing, and he wanted to supply the miners coming upriver with their goods and mule trains to take them and their goods to the mines in the Omanika Mountains. Jack Gillis and his helpful grave. Well, Jack Gillis was a miner. Did he really commit suicide because his fiancée in Prince Edward Island jilted him? And why is his grave helpful? And why was it considered helpful for another 70 years after he died? And then there's Father Maurice and his trembling knees. Father Maurice has a difficult reputation. On the one hand, he was the oblate missionary who even in his own day had a fairly bad reputation among some people. And especially today, it is not considered good. But on the other hand, he was a brilliant scholar who learned First Nations languages and developed ways of writing them down and translated books into Gikizan and Sikani and other languages. And then there's Sperry Klein and his the suspended corpse. Sperry Klein was a young man around Hazelton who was asked by the coroner to go up to one of the telegraph cabins and bring back the body of a young man who had died in the snow and ice after a drinking binge on Christmas Eve. So he had the problems of bringing the corpse back to Vancouver. How did he do it? And why is the corpse suspended? And what happened at the inquest? Slightly macabre, but quite an amusing story. It's one of my favorites. And then there's a fierce long-standing dislike between Mr. Sargent and Mr. Loring in Hazelton, which became quite bitter between 1900 and 1904. on the one hand, we had the provincial magistrate and a merchant, an Anglican, and on the other we had the Indian agent, a federal magistrate who was trying to protect his First Nations charges. It became quite ugly at the time. So that's one of the scandals that perhaps Sarah mentioned in her introduction. Emily Carr was a visitor. She came up twice to Hazelton, once in 1912 and once in 1928. And she wrote about her stories about a time there in 1928 in her book, Clewick. And it's very interesting to me to compare the paintings she did of Hazelton and Kispiox and the other Dixan villages around Hazelton in 1912 with the same depictions in 1928. On her first visit, which she made just after coming back from France, she was more, seemed to me, recording what she saw, and the totem poles and the villages, whereas in 1928, she was very much into recording her own feelings towards the First Nations culture. And it was very much more expressive. And I think a lot of her reputation is based on her imagination as it developed. But certainly the northern part of the province was very much fundamental to her art and her understanding of her art. In 1920, two things, modes of transportation happened in Hazelton. The first car arrived from the south. I know there was an attempt made in 1912, much publicized attempt, and a prize was won, but everyone I think recognizes now that the car in fact was taken apart and carried over part of the roads, part of the journey, because there wasn't a road. So I think the first car to actually re-arrive was in 1920. But also in that year, almost in the same week, the first aeroplane landed. And this was taken from New York by a group of American pilots under a squadron leader, Bill Street, who was carrying on to Nome, Alaska. And that's an amusing story of how at one time they realized there was no landing field around Hazelton, no flat land around Hazelton where they could land. So what to do? Well, he had his problem and he solved it. And then the last one I'm going to mention is a meeting in 1930, a fairly high power meeting in 1930. A representative of the American government, or President Hoover, came to Hazelton. And there he met with the premier of the province, Tolmie, and the lieutenant governor of the province, Bruce, and the governor of Alaska. And they had a meeting in Hazelton to discuss various matters that they were planning at the time. So it was an interesting meeting. And I think perhaps the only time you've had representatives of so many governments at such a high level in Hazelton. So those are a few of the chapters, some of the people. I hope I've intrigued, raised some questions and intrigued some of you about the stories. They are stories, but I think they're well evidenced. I think they're fun. I'm very excited about the book. Crystal.
I mean, okay, you just shared all of them again, and I'm intrigued again, and I read them all already. Like, oh yeah, that's like, so I don't want to, I want to make sure I'm not giving any more away. But I really feel like, Geoff, there's something for everybody in this book. There's like there's stories about despair. There's stories about like a lot about the outdoors and what it must have been like to, be on those trails at that time and be in going to the gold mines. There's searches for riches in there. There's like, I don't know. There's just so much for anybody. And I swear every new story, there was some new surprise. And I did mean it when I think I need to go back and read it again. But I'm curious, you had to decide who to include and who not to include in this, because it can only be so long. So how did you make that decision?
A lot of people were fascinating to me, and I did have to leave some out. some stories out. And how I made the decision was just gut instinct. And it was different. I had a story about Dr. Wrench when he was leaving Hazelton, because in 1936, he left Hazelton and he put everything in his house up for auction. And there's advertisements in the local newspaper, the Almanac Herald, of the auction of Dr. Wrench's house. And I think he probably had a bonfire with many letters and many papers. And there's something sad about him leaving the place he'd spent so many years at. And something final about it too. For a while, I thought it might be interesting to end the book with a story which was an ending. But then I thought, let's stay upbeat at the end. And also, there really wasn't quite enough there for me. It just didn't quite fit. So that's one story I left out. Another story was one I left out because I thought it might be a little confuse me. So if it confused me, I'm sure it would confuse other people. And there's an election in 1912, a provincial election in 1912. And for Hazelton, two Mansons of the same name were running, William Manson and Alexander Manson. And they were not related. And they were not to be confused with the Manson family from Vancouver Island and Comox, a William Manson and a Michael Manson. And in fact, in that election, when it was finalized, it turned out there were more Mansons in the provincial legislature than there were opposition members. And it's an amusing story, but it got quite confusing. And so I left it out for that reason. Who knows, maybe there's another book there somewhere. I hadn't thought of it, but
you need a table of Mansons.
Table of Mansons, that's right.
Yes.
And none of them are related. The first Manson came over in about 1812 with the Hudson Bay Company, and he, for at least 80 years, they were Hudson's Bay people, and so the Manson family was there. That was too confusing. Cataline was another person I thought of writing a book about, or a story about, but someone has written a book about Cataline already, a very good book, recently. And I thought it would be just duplicative. Cataline was the most famous mule operator in certainly Western Canada, perhaps in Western United States, from the gold rush days of 1858 to about 1912. He ran mule trains around the gold camps. And between 1900 and 1912, he ran the mule trains taking supplies up to the cabins on the telegraph line. Interesting character from Catalonia or nearby Catalonia, just across the border probably. Real name Jean Co. He couldn't speak English at all well. Someone once said he spoke 4 languages, but none of them well. So he had a lot of different words. But he and Sperry Klein, the chap with the suspended corpse, were great friends because Sperry Klein spoke English and Afrikaans, and Cataline spoke a mangled version of English and First Nations and Catalan, Spanish, and some French. And somehow they managed to communicate and were great friends. So Cataline is another character. But again, I didn't include him.
Wow. So I'm stuck on what you said a couple moments ago about when the Wrenches had a bonfire and probably, they probably set on fire so much of the papers. I'm thinking about the researcher in you.
Oh gosh.
How are you feeling about the fact that all that is lost?
Distraught. I'm just assuming that because he and his wife went to Ontario, and he would have left everything behind. And so a lot of personal. We've got some of his letters, but not a great number. I found other letters in the archives, the United Church archives in Toronto, but he must have got rid of a lot of stuff. So I'm just guessing that he burnt a lot of old papers. So yes, it would have been fascinating
So you couldn't get it from there, but there definitely was a lot of research that you did here.
Yes.
I'm very curious, and I'm hoping that folks here are also very curious just about how you do all this research. You're talking about the archives like they're your best friends and we all go there all the time, but I'd love to hear more about how you conduct your research.
Well, I enjoy research. I've always enjoyed research because I'm a historian and I like going back to the original sources. And was a lawyer, and I also therefore have to go back to the original sources. You just dig and you get an instinct, and it's a great curiosity. You're wondering, oh, I wonder what's in this file, or what's over here. Yes, a lot of it is online, but you still have to go to the archives and see what isn't online. And story I like to tell is of I was doing research for the Gunnerwood book in Victoria, digging around, and there's not much in the official files because if spoiler alert, if an accused person is acquitted, they don't keep the trial records, or didn't in those days. So there aren't many records of the trial itself. But I dug into the family papers of defense counsel, which are in the archives. And he kept all the original statements, witness statements, sworn statements taken in 1906 at the time of the murder, and again in 1909, other papers. So this is where the treasure trove was. And in the, and for those who don't recall, Gunnerwood was accused of two murders in 1906, and he is alleged to have shot a man, two men dead, on Dr. Wrench's land, as it turned out. But I found this envelope in the archives marked "the bullets," and I opened it, and it tumbled out some pieces of lead. And these are the actual bullets that Dr. Wrench had taken out from Alex McIntosh's body in 1906 when doing the inquest. And that's one of those sort of, oh my God moments.
Oh my gosh.
So yes, you just sniff around, you poke around, wherever you can.
How did you, so I don't want to give away too much about the story, but one of the stories that I found so intriguing was about Hazelton's, I think, was it the first paper, the Queek?
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Bishop William Ridley came out to the Bishop of Caledonia in the late 1870s. He had been in a missionary in Peshawar in northern India and in Germany and England, but now he was a missionary. He was high church, which meant vestments, formal liturgy, communion, etc., etc., etc. One of the leading Anglicans on the coast was called William Duncan, who was based in Metlakatla. He was Anglican, but he was sliding downhill, and he certainly didn't like the smells and bells of the high church. And so he and Bishop Ridley very quickly were fighting hard, even physically fighting, because Bishop Ridley asked Duncan and his First Nations adherents to call him my lord. And Duncan said, I've been telling my parishioners there's only one Lord, and it isn't you, Bishop. And in 1880, partly for a bit of peace and quiet, I think, he went to Hazelton and spent the winter in Hazelton. And the bishop's palace was a shack with no windows, but it was, by definition, a bishop's palace. And he spent the winter in Hazelton with his wife, who herself was a formidable missionary. And for entertainment and amusement and to pass the time, the community, under his guidance, founded a small paper called the Hazelton Queek. It only lasted for about 16 editions, because then the rudimentary printing press the bishop had with him broke, and he had to go back to the coast. And it only printed about 15 copies every week, every month, no, every week. And this is a fascinating little paper that contains tidbits of information about Hazelton at the time, some stories, some weather reports, some local Gikazan legends, and they didn't take themselves too seriously. So it's one of the very earliest newspapers in British Columbia, in the north anyway. And it's a fascinating little thing.
How did you find it?
Well, Hazelton Queek is quite, if you start digging, it's quite well known. But it's very hard to read because it's all handwritten. I'm not entirely sure of the printing process, but it's handwritten, I think, possibly on a wax or some substance like that, and impressions are taken from it. So it's handwriting printed from a wax impression, and at times it's very, very hard to read, not just the handwriting, but it's faded. But I made a transcription of it, sort of words. Some of it's easy to read, some of it is very much a word by word transcription. So I put some of these excerpts from the transcriptions in the book because it does give a very vivid picture, as only writing at the time can give, of Hazelton in the winter of 1880-1881.
It's so fascinating because you said, only like 15 or so copies was made. And in one of your stories, you mentioned that there were 18 non-Indigenous people in Hazelton at around 1896, I think you said. I'd be curious just to hear a little bit more about what it would have been like at that time. Like what was the Skeena region like at that time?
Well, as it is today, it was very beautiful, with these huge rivers coming in. The Bulkley comes in through a very narrow canyon called the Huggelga Canyon, so that is not navigable beyond then. The first steamer to reach Hazelton was 1891, but the river was closed from sometime in October to sometime in early May. So Hazelton during the winter was very much an isolated little town. It didn't grow much food, so food had to be brought in from the outside world in September, late August, September. And the one time the river, this is in 1907, rose so fast it turned over a steamer called the Mount Royal in, I think, September 1907. And 6 people were killed. That was the worst accident on the Skeena. And of course, it's bad luck for them, but it also meant that Hazelton didn't get a lot of its food supplies. And they were on short rations during that winter. And some people, even more serious a problem, catastrophic problem for some, they ran out of liquor. So they come April and May, they were really, really looking forward to when the steam arrived. And the in the bars, every year they used to place bets on the date the first Skeena would arrive. So it was isolated in winter, which meant people, regardless of their differences, had to get on. And even though the population was fairly small, even in 1900, it was a fairly small resident non-Indigenous population with 200 or 300 Indigenous people in Gittimax, which is the community surrounding Hazelton. There was a constant stream of people going through. So you had a constant stream of miners going through town, buying goods, sleeping in tents, and going up to the mines and coming down again, usually poorer, but coming down again. And from 1900 on, a lot of settlers were coming in, staying in, say, Hazelton, and then going to find land in the Bulkley Valley. So the resident population was small, but I have to think that the population coming through was somewhat larger. So it was a busy place. And one other thing about Hazelton that every person who visited there wrote about was the number of dogs. Dogs were used in winter to carry things around. They were pack dogs, and you see lots of photographs of dogs with packs on either side of them. And in summer, they were just allowed to run loose, which meant that they were everywhere. When the steamer arrived, not only the population assembled on the riverbank to welcome it and see friends arriving, goods arriving, but the dogs used to really howl. So the howling of the dogs was something that many people mentioned when they arrived in Hazelton. There are a lot of sidewalks because it was quite muddy, because the mule trains used to come right down in the center of Hazelton and line up by the riverbank so the goods could be unloaded from the steamers coming up and put on the backs of the mules, about 400 pounds on each one, and then be taken on up to the telegraph cabins. And so there's a lot of mud around. So the dogs used to live under the sidewalks and congregate around the restaurants and try and catch food. So there are a lot of fences around to stop the dogs getting into people's gardens. But they were very determined. There's one story that they got on the roof of the Hudson Bay Company store and tore the roof off and got inside the store and helped themselves. So it was quite a fun town.
I feel like you came, like you must have seen so many things that surprised you. And one of the questions that someone asked here was, they're asking, what's the most surprising piece of information that you came across? More surprising than the dogs even?
Well, one surprising thing is just how much documentary there evidence for the early days. Because newspapers started in Victoria in 1858, I think the colonists started, and the one in New Westminster at much the same time. But yes, people wrote letters and no journals, but there's a lot of documentary evidence of the very, very early days, not just the Hudson Bay Company records, but when the gold rush started in the gold rush started in British Columbia in 1858. And in fact, it started before British Columbia was British Columbia, because there's a colony on Vancouver Island, and the colony of British Columbia was set up to establish British law over the Fraser Valley, to keep out, not to keep out, but to provide some legal authority over the miners, especially the American miners who really wanted to take land into the United States. So the gold rush spread up north as people moved on to better fields. So from the early 1860s, gold was found on the Skeena River. The actual gold rush in the Omanika Mountains started in 1869, and the government sent out a magistrate and gold commissioner. So from the very early days, the gold commissioners were sending reports back to Victoria, which are quite detailed reports. So we have quite a lot of evidence from those early days, which is fascinating. Then, of course, Hudson Bay Company records go back to the 1820s for British Columbia, and for other parts of Canada back to 1660.
That's incredible.
It really is, yes. It's fascinating.
Could you tell us more about the Hudson Bay Company archives? You went there, right?
No, I haven't been there yet. There may be a reason I'm going there, but that's another story for another day. The Hudson Bay Company archives were kept in England until I think 1950s, when they were sent to the Hudson's Bay Company headquarters in Winnipeg, where they were and are in the archives in Winnipeg. And they were very, very bureaucratic. And every Hudson Bay Company post had to keep detailed records of accounts, and every post had to keep a journal, post journal, and correspondence ledgers. And these were all sent back to London, where they may or may not have been read, but they're all put on the shelves in London. and then they were sent to Winnipeg. A lot of them have been digitized. A lot of them are available online. So far, I've just been able to read them and in many cases transcribe them, what I needed to transcribe online. And they are very, I was going to say in your face, but they really are. They take you right back there, because it's someone who's sitting down at a desk or a table at some post, whether it's in Fort St. James or Fort St. George or Cumberland House or wherever, and just writing down what happened that day, and turning over the page the next day, keeping on writing. And if they wrote a letter, they kept a copy in the correspondence ledger, and then if they kept accounts, and then they wrote how many beaver skins they took in and how many musquashes they took in. So it's all there. It's all down and you've got photocopies online of their actual physical ledgers, which I find as a historian just fascinating.
And I find, as one of your readers and fans, that I love the fact that you have putting it into a way that we could read it and digest it in a story form. Because one of the things I loved a lot about the stories is you brought us from like a whole life, not just the part where they're in Hazelton, but also where they were from and where, if people traveled away after Hazelton, especially the people who were travelers. I really loved that part. You gave us like a real snapshot of the character of the person, and you make all those like archives more accessible to those of us who would like to read it in book form.
Well, they're the stories of the people, and they do have lives before and after they're in Hazelton. So sometimes it really, I find, helps illuminate their characters. For example, to know that Bishop Ridley was sent as a missionary to Peshawar in the northwest frontier of India, where he was in that town. He and his wife were the only white people in the whole city, which is a fairly large city. And I mean, it's violent now. You can imagine what it was like in those days. And he started a school, still existing, and his wife, who was and I'm very sorry we don't know more about her, and indeed the other women who contributed to the history of the North. But she started what's called the Zenana movement, which is basically a women's aid society. She would go into the private quarters of the women in town where men couldn't go, and talk to them about their health and what they needed, and try to improve their lives as well. And so when she came to northern British Columbia, she had a whole history of service herself behind her.
It's great. I know you said there's a little frustration. There is not enough written about women in history, but you did write some stories that focus on women. Would you like to share a little bit about the women of the North?
There's Emily Carr. She wasn't from the North, but she was certainly in the North. There was Jane Ridley. There was a lady called Constance Cox. Now, I mentioned Thomas Hankin, who helped found Hazelton in the late 1860s, 1869, 1870, 71. And his daughter was Constance Hankin. And when she was born, he reportedly had a huge feast. He called it a potlatch, and gave away huge amounts of money and goods to everyone who came. And he died 5 years later. And her mother, Margaret, who was half Nishka, I think, her mother remarried the Indian agent, Richard Loring, who was not medically trained, but he knew some medicine. And there's a story that she tells that when she used to help him as a nurse in her early teens. And one time when he had to amputate the leg of someone on the trail, she was there and had to administer the chloroform at the age of 12. And when Dr. Rynch, Horace Rynch, arrived in Kispiox, he needed a nurse in Hazelton because his wife, who was a trained nurse, she was pregnant and she couldn't travel at that time 8 or 9 miles by horseback or sledge to act as a nurse in Hazelton. So he hired Constance Cox as his first nurse. And in fact, the first major operation that she acted as his nurse assistant on, she wasn't trained or anything, she just had, she had some
on the trail training.
On the trail training, very practical training. The first operation that she helped him on in October 1902 was on her mother. And it was an operation Dr. Rynch did to remove a cancerous growth from her mother. And that was a major operation, as you can imagine, at the time. And Dr. Rynch, for this one, he actually asked Dr. Wilson to come up from the coast to help him because it was such a major operation. And it's probably done in Loring's own home because at that time he didn't have a hospital. So he probably had to go into Loring's own home. And what he used to do was he took a door with him to act as an operating surface because he needed something absolutely flat. And a door was easier to carry and it was absolutely flat. So he could place it on a table and have sufficient space. He then used to surround the operating surface with sheets soaked in carbolic as a form of antiseptic. And then he used to, he was a missionary. He used to, before the operation, he used to go down on his knees and pray for divine assistance in the operation he was about to do. And so Constance Cox was his first nurse, his first couple of years. And then when he built a hospital, he had to get trained nurses from the East. And she stayed constant throughout Hazelton history and his life. And in fact, when Ptolemy and Ernest Sawyer, who was a representative of President Herbert Hoover, came to Hazelton in 1930 with the governor of Alaska, Constance Cox, she married a man called Cox, she was the interpreter for them because she knew 5 native languages. So she was able to act as the interpreter for them when speaking with local people. So she's quite a colorful character in her own right.
Yeah, I did really like reading her story. So
yeah.
I also really enjoyed it is who also was a nurse, May, the Irish.
May Hogan, yes.
Yes.
May Hogan. Oh, that's another great story. May Hogan was an Irish girl. Her father was a missionary on the coast who came out in the early 1890s. She finished her education in Ireland and came out in about 1899. She trained as a nurse and became a matron at the Rynch Memorial Hospital in 1910 or 11. She remained as matron in 1917 when she joined up to go to France. 2 of the chapters are about people from Hazelton who went to the First World War because I think their stories are important. So in the first story, the soldiers who went to France wrote back letters which were published in the Omnica Herald. I'm not sure how they got past the censor, but they did, and they vividly reveal what it was like to be in the trenches in France in the First World War. But May Hogan is a woman from Hazelton who went to war, and the National Archives in Ottawa contain the records from the hospital where she was nursing at. And so we get a very vivid picture of what it was like to be a nurse in the hospital in France. She wasn't absolutely on the front lines, but she was at Boulogne, which was bombed quite often by the German bombers because it was where the troops came across from France. So her story is vivid because it shows how Hazelton people reached out into the world and participated in the First World War. She came back to Hazelton after the war, and Dr. Rynch's wife had died of cancer herself in 1920. And in 1927, 28, I forget which, May Hogan became the second wife of Dr. Rynch. So
Gave
she's
away the ending. That was like that was like the twist to be like, oh, they get married.
I shouldn't give away too much.
That's okay. It's still a good.
I'm just so excited about these stories and so enthusiastic about these lives.
Still a good story, and the part where you pulled out the dates of the hospital journals or
Yes.
from one, and so what you said, it really paints quite a story of what it would have been like on the front line. So even just for that, I think that part is worth a read. I know somebody's asked to Caitlin Press. Sarah has asked to ask questions from the folks that we have here, so feel free to put questions in. I'm looking if there's any there coming up, but I'll continue to ask at the same time because I have lots of curious questions. I'm curious. I don't know if you ever would have been a camper, but I'm curious, who of all these people would you want to spend like maybe an excursion or an adventure with?
I think if I was looking for someone practical, I'd probably go with Sperry Klein. Sperry Klein was one of the colourful characters around Hazelton. It was he who had been tasked with bringing back the frozen dead body from the telegraph line. And I'm not going to reveal the ending of that story.
I won't either.
No, don't. And he stayed in and around Hazelton for about 25 years. And he was very practical. He'd been a policeman and a soldier in South Africa. He'd been a river pilot on the river. He'd been a miner. He'd been a general, helpful, useful man around town. And one of the things Sperry Klein did was take the mails. He was a mail carrier because between 1891 and 1913, when the railway arrived, the steamers, which brought the mail in summer, maybe once a week, every 10 days or so, didn't run. So in 1900, which is when Dr. Rynch arrived, mails came in by dog team twice a winter. It increased to a giddying number in about 1904 to 4 times a winter. So that mail had to be brought in either from, Prince Rupert wasn't founded until 1906 as a railway terminus, but either to Port Essington or to Kitimat. And he used to take the mails, and he had stories of how difficult it was to take the mail down to the coast. And there's one story that he tells, because he often had to take down people from the hospital to the coast. And one time he had to take down someone who had mental problems of various sorts, who was going down to have hospital treatment in Vancouver. And this chap was very cheerful, very presentable. And they became quite good friends on the few days down to towards the coast. And they arrived in Port Essington to wait for the steamer. And they were, after their 6 days on the trail, they were looking ragged and dirty, and they decided they should both have haircuts. Well, there was only time for one of them to have a haircut. And the man said to Sperry Klein, "Look, I want to make a good impression when I get to Vancouver, and they might, think I'm, not so unbalanced as everyone thinks I am. So why don't I have the haircut and get spruced up? So they went to the barbers, and Sperry Klein took him to deliver to the police station, so someone else could be responsible for taking the man south. And the man stepped, now neat and tidy and haircut and shaved and very nice, stepped up to the policeman and said, "Well, here he is. I brought the customer down for you. You can take him over from here." And Sperry Klein, who was still ragged and scruffy and looking, at the best of times, he looked, as someone said, as if like a scarecrow who'd escaped from a field. At the best of times, was really looking pretty disheveled. And so the policeman thought, well, clearly, this is a guy. Okay, don't worry about it. I'll take him down. And so Sperry Klein, thinking it was a great joke, reached down to his briefcase to fetch out the committal papers. And he realized he left his briefcase in the barber shop. And here he was being taken into custody by the policeman to be sent down to Vancouver. And I'm not going to tell you what the ending of this story was. But
luckily,
but Sperry Klein was a very practical person. So if I was going out on anything that required practicality, like camping or on an adventure on a field trip, I'd probably go with him.
Well, you might make an excellent choice for Sperry Klein too, because it sounds like he really got caught up in something there, and your law background might help him. So maybe the two of you would have been great adventurers together.
Yes, maybe. Sperry Klein joined a posse in 1914 to look for the bank robbers who raided the New Hazelton Bank in the famous bank robbery, where there was a famous shootout. And the citizens surrounded the bank and shot, in a fierce gunfight battle, shot 3 of the bank robbers dead, 4 more escaped, and a posse that was rounded up to find 3 other wounded bank robbers brought them in. So Sperry Klein was sworn into that posse, and he then joined the BC Provincial Police and stayed with the Provincial Police until the 1940s. So he's a useful guy to know. But apropos your question, if I was being mischievous, I would invite a couple of people to dinner. And I thought maybe it'd be nice to invite Bishop Ridley together with Father Maurice, Bishop Ridley being Anglican, Father Maurice being Catholic. And they're both very self-opinionated and both very authoritarian. And then I'd sort of ask them questions like, what is original sin, or some theological question, and see them hammer it out between them.
I like that you changed the setting to dinner instead of camping, because I feel like more could go wrong in this setting that's more like camping.
Well, that'd be the fun. Or I'd get the Hudson Bay Company people together, William Tolmie, and Thomas Hankin, and the Hudson's Bay Company people, and McGillivray, and sit them down and get them talking about the Hudson's Bay Company. Because Tolmie himself came from Hudson's Bay Company family. In fact, it was his father who had fired Thomas Hankin from a job with the Hudson's Bay Company in the 1860s. And Tolmie, who was Premier of the province in the 1930s, Tory Premier, he didn't want to become Premier. He had a federal seat as well, but there's a big powwow, I think, in a big meeting of the Tories to try and persuade him to run as the Tory Premier for the province in, I think, Chilliwack. And he couldn't be persuaded. And eventually 2 or 3 of them got together in the meeting and started talking in Chinook jargon, because they knew Chinook jargon, which was an old language, lingua franca of the coast. That was a trading language amongst all the people of the coast, all the First Nations, and it was a mixture of Chinook language, French, English, Spanish, and all put together in a sort of vocabulary that everyone knew. So Tolmie and his Tory grandees talked in Chinook jargon, and eventually Tolmie was persuaded that he should run as Premier. And one of the nicest men to be Premier of the province, it was said, but one of the least successful, because he was Premier during the Depression. and he just couldn't handle it.
So it's interesting because Duncan is asking, why did the book end in the 1930s, or perhaps phrased a little differently, what's the ideas that you have for any characters afterwards? Or maybe you want to add in there what comes next. What are you planning, Geoff?
Well, the first question first. 1930 is a good time. I had to draw a time somewhere, and I had a nice story to end with. And it's also the date when the new hospital was opened. So it seemed to be a natural place to end a story. And also I'm much more comfortable, maybe that's my legal and historical background speaking, I'm much more comfortable with written evidence that I can hold up and dissect and look at and think, well, does this make sense? Is this substantiated by anywhere else? Do I believe this story? But after 1930, I started getting into having to speak to people who remembered, and I'm just more comfortable with the written record. So it seemed to be a nice ending, a nice time. It's also with the opening of the new hospital, it seemed to be the ending of one age and the opening of a new one. So it seemed a nice time to end. What am I planning? There's no good.
It's not the end, is it?
No. I'm looking at another forgotten person from British Columbia's history. A person who wrote some memoirs in 1914 that I used and built on. And it's a person who, for a time, was running the province for a short time. And if I mention the name, no one will have heard of him. And I like that idea. I like the idea of giving fresh light to someone who's been forgotten. His name's Philip Hankin. He happens to be the brother of Thomas Hankin, who founded Hazelton. And Philip Hankin had a fascinating life, to me, a fascinating life. He joined the Royal Navy at the age of 14 in 1849. He spent 10 years with the British Navy trying to stop slavery in the Indian Ocean and in West Africa. And because the British Navy had 70 years on those coasts trying to stop slavery. He then came out to British Columbia in 1857, which is 1 year before the gold rush started. So he has memories of Victoria before it was completely changed by the rush of gold miners. And he spent a few years with the Navy mapping the coasts as a surveyor. He then left the Navy, having fallen in love with British Columbia and Vancouver Island colony. And he went up to Barkerville to become a gold miner. He walked up there. You think that's a long way. It's very Klein walked from Vancouver up to the Yamanika Mountains and to Hazelton. So anyway, Hankin walked up to the gold mines, failed miserably, and came back to Victoria in 1864. And within a year, he was chief of police for the colony of Vancouver Island. And a few years later, through various means, he was appointed colonial secretary. And he had famous problems with the governor. But the governor died. And because Hankin, aged about 30, 31, was a senior government position, he ran the colony until the new governor arrived 3 or 4 months later. And then he was the colonial secretary until Confederation in 1871. and then he took on other jobs. But it's a fascinating story of ups and downs and travel and personal reminiscences, personal stories. So I'm working on this.
Amazing. Well, I'm going to guess that you'll let me know, because you know I'm going to want to read it. Like I'm sure lots of the others who are here are going to want to read it too. There's one more question in here. I'm going to shorten it. Any interest in writing historical fiction?
I don't know. Maybe I should. There's lots of, I mean, many of these stories could form the basis of a historical novel for sure. I haven't got one and being planned. Who knows? Maybe there's lots of good stories. Even lots of ones I haven't talked about yet. I mean, James May walked from Tennessee to Hazelton, effectively. Here's a lovely story of a gold miner. Here's a great story. So what I find difficult is taking the historical record and then making up facts, because the record is there, but you have to not just get inside the character's head, you have to create a narrative, which necessarily means making up facts and adding parts to the story that you don't know anything about and you'll be speculating. And if it's a historical story, you'd have to add in some form of romantic thread. I mean, come on, you'd have to. And I've got no, I mean, unless I reach out and write something like Wolf Hall, which Henry Mantel wrote, or one of those stories, and there's some really first-rate historical novels. I don't know, maybe there's one in there.
Maybe there's someone here in the audience who would want to co-write with you.
No, I'm not sure in co-writing. Writing is a solitary, for me anyway, it's a solitary pleasure.
Well, Geoff, we're just after 8 o'clock, and I'm sure folks have enjoyed this, and we could go on and on, but we did plan for an hour. So I'm thinking Sarah's going to come back in here and wind us down.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Yeah, I just thought I'd pop back on real quick to remind everybody that they can buy the book with the little green button at the bottom, and that'll take you directly to the Book Warehouse website. You can also find Geoff's other books and this book at your local bookstore or through the Caitlin Press website. Some of the other stories that Geoff spoke about tonight are available in his other books in great detail, very exciting. I want to thank Crystal for hosting and asking questions on behalf of us readers and drawing attention to some of the wonderful stories in this book. And of course, thank you, Geoff, for writing this book and sharing some of the intriguing teasers and snippets and behind the scenes from your research. I think I'll be thinking about that image of you opening that envelope and finding those bullets for a very long time. That really stuck with me. I didn't even know they had things like that in the archives. Blew me away. And thank you to everybody for attending. I know that we have people from all across BC and around the world. We're so grateful that you tuned in and were able to join us. That's the wonderful thing about these online events, is that people can pop in from all over the place. And yeah, thank you all so much, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Crystal.
Thank you.